have consequences, because there's people that will blame the Japanese public for supporting, this road to war that they're going down. But to not support it seems a little counterintuitive. I mean, how likely is it to imagine this Japanese public, conditioned the way we've talked about, with all the carrots and sticks and cultural head binding and punishment for people who didn't toe the line and all these other things, how likely is it to have imagined that they would do anything other than support their troops when the troops are victorious in the field, right? When it's their own sons out there fighting. And of course, you got the government pushing the super propaganda button all the time. How likely is it that you're going to see anything other than what you did see? What's more, forget all the cultural head binding stuff I've been throwing out there and just think about your own people. How hard is it to imagine, most of them not coming out and supporting the troops? It's something that can be reliably counted upon. So if that's the case, can you really hold people accountable and say they had any, real options as a group, right? En masse. Sometimes individuals surprise us, but en masse, was there really another road for the Japanese patriotic civilians to go down once their troops were fighting in the field? It's an interesting question, as I said, but I guess the way I look at it is I look at it and think, God, that could happen to anybody. And if that means we can all be bombed and deserve it, well, that's a scary thought, isn't it? In the case of the uber patriotic Japanese during this period, it's extra scary because this is like a blank check for whatever this Guantang army is going to do. Control from the central authority is tenuous at best. And over the next several months, this Guantang army is going to destroy Japanese diplomatic credibility with the rest of the world, because over and over the Japanese government and even the top military officials are going to say, we're not going to advance any farther. Everything's going to stay the way it is. And then almost as they're saying it, the army in the field would advance. At one point, the army itself, the Guantang army, says, we promise we will not advance on this city. And they do. So at a certain point, not only is the rest of the world not believing anything the Japanese government is saying, but it's making them extra angry. I read one historian who made a point of, listen, this is a really bad time for the world in the Great Depression and all this. Everybody's got their own problems. Every country on the world stage would love to be able to say, I'm just going to ignore this. It's a long way away. But looking like they're being played for fools over and over by the Japanese government instigates pushback that might not otherwise have been there. In the defense of the Japanese government, they may have believed it every time they said, we're not going to move any farther. And then think about the weird position it puts the government in when the army does move farther against orders, has great victories, conquers more territory. The media shows the newsreels and plays it up. The public is cheering. What are you supposed to do? Denounce them? And remember, nobody in the foreign world out there at all knows that you don't control your own army. You don't want to admit that to them, so you kind of have to own these things now. It's a bizarre situation. It gets even more weird at times, too, because, and you can't tell again if there's a forced feeling to this, if you feel like you have to do it or if they really want to. But I mean, the emperor has to have the general of the Guantang army over for tea. Private meeting in the palace. I mean, it's this enormous honor. And he's being honored for all these conquests in Manchuria that he went against orders to do. I mean, what sort of message are you sending here? It's bizarre. And I should point out, there have always been some historians and writers out there that suggest that it's possible that you could look at this entire situation with this Guantang army acting on its own as a case of Gekkokujo on a mass scale, an army-wide level, an entire army, being insubordinate for high-minded moral reasons. And maybe you say their heart was in the right place, and maybe because of that you forgive them, especially since they keep winning. See how that goes? But if it's true that this army really did all this on its own, and for super patriotic reasons, right? Well, then they've just managed to doom the very country and deified emperor that they worship, because they've gotten Japan into a cycle now that it's not going to be able to get out of. The best example I came up with is unfortunately of limited practical value, because unless you've gone out too deep in the ocean, with the breakers crashing on you, you're not going to know what I mean. But in my head, it seems like the perfect analogy. And if you've ever done it, you know what I mean when you get trapped in that no man's land between the breaking surf and the shore. Too far away from the shore to get to safety before the next giant wave crushes you. So there's only one option. You have to go out deeper into the surf so you can dive under that giant wave before it starts crashing. The problem, as we all know, is that when you come up sputtering from that, you have another giant breaker bearing down on you, and you're even farther away from the shore. So you have to go out even deeper and dive under that one. Of course, you can't keep this up forever. Eventually, you drown following that strategy, and the Japanese are going to drown in China. And if you believe the army defenders out there who were trying to explain what they were doing, they're going to drown in China simply trying to find a defensible place to stop advancing. The army claims it's got bandits to deal with, for example. These bandits are probably really Chinese guerrilla fighters, and at one point there'll be like 350,000 of them. That's a lot of bandits, by the way. There will be a constant drumbeat of things that are called incidents when Japanese troops and bandits, or Japanese troops and Chinese troops, or Japanese troops and warlords troops will have some sort of a, gunfight or something, and all heck can break loose for a while. That the Japanese will take another city in response to that, and they'll settle down, and then another incident. If you string all these incidents together from 1931 to about 1937, you get, there were like 50 in a really short period of time. So you get a lot of incidents, and some historians like to refer to that whole period as an era of undeclared war between Japan and China. Neither side, by the way, wanted to declare war for different reasons. The Japanese are trying to make it look like nothing's really going on here. Nothing to see here, great powers. It's not a war. We have a bunch of incidents going on. And the Chinese have their own problems. More on that in a second. These incidents can get very large, though. There will be an incident in late January in Shanghai, which will go on until March 1932. Shanghai, by the way, I believe the second largest city in Asia after Tokyo itself, between 3 and 4 million people in a giant city that is an urban environment. So you can only imagine what it's like to have fighting going on in the streets of Shanghai. You will have at one point, it starts off with Japanese Marines, but they get into trouble because there's very stiff Chinese resistance and street fighting. So the Japanese government sends in more troops. So at one point, you'll have 100,000 Japanese ground troops, several hundred planes, like 75 or so ships. That's incident doesn't really do it justice. In fact, the high numbers when you start adding up civilian and military deaths for this incident run somewhere between 10 and 20,000 killed. That's quite a few people in something, that sounds as small as an incident. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Japanese here, and we've been pointing out that they've been fighting, quote, end quote, Chinese. But who are the Chinese during this period? It's worth examining, the resistance here for a minute. The resistance used to be, 10 years before this time, a bunch of fragmented states, the disunited states of China, perhaps you could have called it. But in the intervening, 8 years, there's been quite a bit of consolidation. The number one consolidator is a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who is a fascinating character, a Japanese protege, maybe you could almost call it, but a Chinese patriot. He's a guy who went to military schools and whatnot in Japan, learned a lot from the Japanese, came back, participated in the overthrow of the imperial system, and the emperor was a key, protege of the guy who started the, first Chinese Republic. And he's been fighting ever since to maintain sort of, a put together China. He's a difficult guy to pin down because he seems to be willing to do whatever it takes, to achieve his goals. And his goals are both to create this, great China that he sees, rising from the ashes of this terrible low point in Chinese history. At the same time, a China maybe run by him, maybe perpetually. He's got this military dictator side to him that his critics, harp on. So bear that in mind. but he's a relatively remarkable person. I mean, think about somebody trying to put the United States back together again if it broke up into its component states against the will of those states, by the way. And you get an idea of the task we're talking about here. Chiang Kai-shek is part and is the leader most of the time of a governing / political party called the Kuomintang. We used to call it the Kuomintang when I was a kid. So if I slip into, bad habits, you'll know why. But that leader and that party are sort of the big dog in this Chinese reunification thing going on during the 1920s. He's the major threat that these Japanese people, in Manchuria see. I mean, this Chiang Kai-shek guy could put China back together again, and then where are we? His main competition in order to achieve this, though, are communists. People getting help, for example, from the new Soviet Union. Chiang, by the way, getting help from the Soviet Union too, but he'll take help from anybody who will give it to him. All he wants to do is achieve his goals. The communists are working with the communists, but they're maybe the second great power in China during this era. And they and Chiang will have this terrible struggle with each other. Sometimes they'll, kiss and make up long enough to fight the common enemy. But Chiang Kai-shek's point most of the time is that he wants to unify China first, destroy his internal enemies first, and then turn on the Japanese. So when during this period the Chinese appear to really not be fighting back too much and deliberately sort of taking the easy road, backing up, making nice, I mean, it's all because Chiang Kai-shek's got his eyes elsewhere. He's trying to defeat the communists in his country. And by the way, as I said, when this guy's taken, money and arms and organization from the Soviet Union, the Western press is portraying him as a communist stooge. He's the red general to them. But later on, he's going to turn on the communists, and he may be, this is arguable, it's off the top of my head, he may hold the record for most communists or suspected communists killed. He'll kill like 300,000 of them in one purge. He may have killed millions of them, and many of them may not have been communists at all. He's famous for a phrase he may or may not have said, so let me issue that disclaimer right here. But the phrase was something like, he'd rather kill 1,000 innocent people than let one communist get through. It's a little twist on the old American idea, that better 100 guilty should go free than one innocent man be prosecuted. In any case, Chiang Kai-shek seems to be pretty focused on China and conquering it first and then turning its enormous weight on the Japanese invader afterwards is his policy. And that allows this undeclared war to continue longer than maybe a lot of the other leaders in China and Chiang's underlings want it to. Meanwhile, though, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese have complained to the only body out there that's available to do that, the League of Nations, the prototype, as we said earlier, for the United Nations. This will become a practical test for the Rainbows and Unicorns organization that is supposed to prevent aggressive war, because the Chinese are asserting that that's what you have here. And not only that, the Japanese are the signatories to a number of treaties during these so-called interwar years designed to make war, if not uncommon, then maybe even totally illegal. One of these is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, for example. And sometimes that's the way its supporters sort of touted it. We're going to make war illegal because people signed a treaty. So you can see how that goes. Nonetheless, the Chinese make the complaint. The League of Nations has to respond to it. They send investigators in 1932 early to look at the train tracks that were blown up and examine everything, talk to all sides. And while they're doing this, the Japanese military's creating a puppet state. They're going to call Manchukuo. And the reason you create a puppet state instead of, trying to conquer it directly like you would in the old days is because you just don't do that anymore. It's just not done. Great powers don't conquer others. You create a sort of a Wilsonian sort of colony where you call it the return of the Manchu people to controlling their own destiny. The Japanese brought in the last emperor of China, a Manchu, put him on the throne, made it look like, hey, we've restored the Manchurians to their rightful place. We Asians are all in this together. It's going to have this Pan-Asian flavor to it. Meanwhile, the Japanese army is going to defend it. It's going to send, economically anything Japan wants back to Japan. and the Japanese will control all the major decisions. It's a puppet state, but the rest of the world is going to say, you can't keep it. The United States will be the most vociferous critic. And by the way, the U.S. is operating on many levels here. On one level, there's a moral level. The Americans have a lot of Christian missionaries, for example, in China, and they get to watch a lot of this stuff unfold. And it's horrible on the ground. So they're complaining for moral reasons. But the Americans have huge economic stakes in this region, something called the open door policy that they want to keep open. They don't want anything that would threaten the good thing that they have going trade-wise with China. And if Japan starts taking all these areas or making treaties that, lock China up for themselves, well, that cuts out U.S. interests. So there's a lot of reasons the Americans aren't so happy about this. They'll invoke something called, from this period, called the Stimson Doctrine, which basically says the U.S. is not going to acknowledge, support, countenance, or any territories that are, created through aggression. Whether or not it's aggression is up to the League of Nations. They do their investigation. They come back with a report that is actually so even-handed, you have a feeling that the great powers didn't want anything where they had to confront anybody, because as I said earlier, they all have their own issues. They'd rather look the other way. But the Japanese required, a real acceptance that they'll be allowed to keep Manchuria. They did not get that. So when forced to make a choice between the steroid that could make them maybe as big as they want, or, staying in the good guy column, off the global international naughty list, they chose keeping the Manchurian addiction. And this will be disastrous in the long run. In a practical sense, what it means is when the Japanese don't get what they want from the League of Nations, they walk out of the League of Nations. Trendsetters in that regard, because Germany and Italy will eventually join them. But to people like the Americans and the British and the French, this looks like choosing the dark side in an ever increasingly dark, world, as the storm clouds on the international horizon deepen and darken and threaten. The Japanese have decided, in terms of this international community idea, this rainbows and unicorns thing of the past, it's just a plot by the great powers to keep the status quo. We're out. But when you think of, what options they actually had in this regard, what can the Japanese really do? If we're going to walk a mile in the moccasins of the Japanese government here, we have to ask what real choices they had. In the same way, we were wondering about the responsibility level of your average patriotic Japanese citizen. Well, in this case, sometimes I think we pretend like there's a fork in the road here for these governments, and we hold them accountable for making the wrong directional choice, at the fork in the road, when maybe there was no fork there at all. And this is a wondering, but I mean, in this case, look at what was being asked of this Japanese government. They're being asked to give up this territory that many great thinkers have been out there in Japanese writing and whatnot, and many of the prominent people saying Japan has to have in order to survive and protect themselves in part from these very great powers who banded together in this League of Nations are telling them they have to give it back. You can't have these steroids to get as big as we are. The Japanese, as we've already pointed out, right, have this long laundry list of Rain Man-like grievances, some of which are real. You also have that wonderful element in play that we talked about, the number of people now that have died to conquer this place, the number of people that have died to protect the investment in money that's been invested to create this wonderful safe area in China by the South Manchurian Railway. I mean, it just goes on and on. So if you're a political leader that's going to see this as a way to avoid having a showdown with the other great powers in the world, and your choice is you have to give this back, could you realistically do that? I mean, I would think that the loss of face on the world stage, the embarrassment of having to, listen to what everyone's saying and go with your tail between your legs. I mean, I think that alone would doom a politician, with the voters in an electoral system, wouldn't you? But what about, real doom as opposed to electoral doom? Because this is the period where, if you realistically suggested giving Manchuria back because the great powers were telling you to, you might not live to see the next month. because we talked earlier about something one American, I think, referred to as government by assassination in Japanese history. This is the period where that skyrockets, and it's the high water mark of that between like 1931 and 1936. And you will see a number of major figures, not just political figures, but also corporate ones, gunned down. How about the one in 1932 where 11 naval cadets from a faction in the Navy that wants a military dictatorship and a return to the emperor and the golden age and all that, they storm into the building where the prime minister is, and the 11 of them kill him. And there's even a conversation that's recorded that happens, while it's going on, where the prime minister says something to the effect of, if I could only talk to you, you would understand. And the person who's about to kill him says, dialogue is useless. Boom. The people who kill the prime minister release a manifesto, one that historian James L. McLean reprints, and he says shows the depth of emotional anger experienced by these people who want to put the emperor back on the throne to fix all the injustices. The manifesto says, quote, look straight at the present state of your fatherland, Japan. Where, we dare ask, can you find the genuine manifestation of the godliness of the imperial country of Japan? Political parties are blind in their pursuit of power and egoistic gains. Large enterprises are firmly in collusion with politicians as they suck the sweat and blood of the common people. Bureaucrats and police are busy defending the corrupt politico-industrial complex. Diplomacy is weak-kneed. Education is rotten to the core. Now is the time to carry out drastic, revolutionary change. Rise and take action now. End quote. McLean, in his book, Japan and Modern History, says it's these kinds of coups, along with the challenges posed by Manchuria, that dooms everything. He writes, quote, the Manchurian incident and the violence from the right in 1931 and 1932 marked a Copernican turn in Japan's foreign relations and domestic politics. On the continent, the conception of the new state, carved from Chinese territory and dominated by a wing of the Japanese military, soured Sino-Japanese relations beyond redemption, began the isolation of Japan from an infuriated West, which viewed Japanese actions as naked aggression, and propelled the island nation along a path that would lead it to even more dangerous foreign confrontations. At home, the assassinations and attempted coups exposed the fragile